People often think of anger as a flaw, as if it is some unnecessary emotion that should be eliminated entirely. But anger itself is not the problem. Anger is a signal, a messenger. It is the psyche's way of telling you something is out of order, that a value has been violated, that an expectation has gone unmet, or that fear has taken hold beneath the surface. If you try to suppress anger without understanding it, you don't solve anything. You merely bury it alive. And emotions that are buried alive have a way of coming back stronger, darker, and harder to manage. And imagine a fire alarm going off in your house. You wouldn't respond by smashing the alarm to silence it and then pretending the fire doesn't exist. That would be foolish, yet this is how most people deal with anger. They try to silence the alarm, distract themselves, or lash out, but they rarely investigate the cause. The real question isn't, how do I get rid of this anger, but rather, why is it here? What is it trying to tell me? Most of the time, anger emerges when something you care about feels threatened. It might be your dignity, your sense of fairness, your goals, or even your time. If someone cuts you off in traffic, you feel anger because your safety and your right to the road feel violated. If a close friend betrays you, anger arises because trust and loyalty, values you cherish, have been broken. And if you're honest, sometimes your anger is not about the other person at all. It's about you. It's about the gap between who you are and who you know you could be. Unmet potential is fertile ground for frustration, and frustration, when left unchecked, often mutates into anger. This is why anger can be so deceptive. On the surface, it looks like rage at another person, at the world, at circumstances. But dig a little deeper and you often find pain, fear, or disappointment. A man who feels disrespected at work might explode in anger, but beneath that fire is the fear that he is not valued, that his contributions don't matter. A woman who lashes out at her partner may, in truth, be terrified of abandonment. The anger is real, but it is not the root, it is the mask. Understanding this matters because if you mistake the mask for the root, you'll forever be fighting symptoms rather than causes. You'll shout at the driver, resent the boss, or punish the partner, yet remain blind to what truly fuels your reactions. And so anger will keep returning again and again like a persistent guest at your door. To control anger, then, the first step is not suppression, it is recognition. You must cultivate the discipline to pause and ask yourself, what is this anger trying to reveal? What deeper need or fear lies beneath it? That question transforms anger from a blind force into a source of insight. It allows you to see not only the external triggers, but also the internal patterns that magnify them. This isn't easy. It requires humility because sometimes the answer is uncomfortable. Sometimes your anger exposes your own pride, your own impatience, your own insecurity. It's far easier to blame others than to admit that part of the fire comes from within. But the courageous path, the path of growth, is to face that truth. Because when you see clearly, you reclaim control, you stop being a puppet pulled by the strings of emotion, and you begin to guide yourself with awareness. But let me be clear, anger is not always bad. Without anger, societies would never have changed. Revolutions, reforms, and acts of courage often begin with righteous anger at injustice. But the difference between righteous anger and destructive anger is the difference between a controlled fire that warms a home and a wildfire that burns everything down. Both are fire, the difference is mastery. So if you want to control anger, you cannot begin by silencing it. You must learn its language. Ask yourself, what value is being violated? What fear is being exposed? What pain is being revealed? When you answer honestly, anger becomes a teacher, not a tyrant. It points you toward the real work that needs to be done, whether that is healing old wounds, setting firmer boundaries, or confronting uncomfortable truths about yourself. And once you begin to understand the root of your anger, something extraordinary happens. You don't just control it, you transform it. You realize that the energy of anger can be directed. It can become fuel for courage, for clarity, for change. But only if you are willing to step back, to look deeper, to refuse to be ruled by the first impulse to lash out. So the next time you feel anger rising within you, don't rush to silence it, and don't surrender to it either. Pause, ask what it's telling you. Treat it not as an enemy, but as a signal that points to something unresolved and that requires your attention. Because anger, at its core, is neither good nor bad. It is raw energy waiting to be directed. And whether it becomes destruction or discipline depends entirely on whether you have the courage to listen before you act. If you understand the root of your anger, you no longer fear it. And if you no longer fear it, most people you can finally anger explodes in an instant, as if it suddenly appears out of nowhere. But that's not true. There's always a moment, a tiny gap between the trigger and your reaction. It's small, but it's there. And within that space lies the difference between chaos and control, between regret and strength. That space is where choice lives. The problem is that most people don't use it. They let their emotions seize them immediately. Someone insults them, and the words fly back like bullets. A driver cuts them off, and their hands slam the horn before they've even thought about it. A loved one makes a mistake, and anger lashes out before understanding can arrive. In those moments, people say things they don't mean, break relationships they value, or even make choices that alter the course of their lives, all because they reacted rather than responded. Now, what's the difference? A reaction is automatic. It's instinctive, impulsive, blind. It comes from the part of the brain designed for survival, the part that sees threat and strikes back. A response, on the other hand, is intentional. It's shaped by reflection, by awareness, by choice. It doesn't suppress the anger, it channels it. A response uses that gap, however small, to pause, to evaluate, and to act with purpose rather than impulse. Think about fire again. A reaction is throwing gasoline on the flames the moment they spark. A response is choosing whether to contain that fire, to redirect it, or to let it burn something that actually needs to be burned. One destroys, the other transforms. But here's the challenge. To respond instead of react requires discipline. It means catching yourself in the moment of heat when every nerve is screaming for release. That is not easy. It feels unnatural at first, almost impossible. But like any muscle, self-control grows with use. The more you practice pausing, the stronger your ability becomes. Is remarkably simple. Breathe. It sounds trivial, almost childish, but it's profound. When anger surges, your body goes into fight mode, your heartbeat rises, your breath shortens, your muscles tighten. By forcing yourself to take a slow breath, you interrupt that cycle. You remind your body that you are not under immediate threat, and you give your mind a fraction of space to think. And in that space, you can choose. Another method is perspective. Ask yourself, if I act on this anger right now, what will the cost be? Will this matter in an hour, in a day, in a year? Most anger feels urgent in the moment, but meaningless later. Perspective shrinks the fire back down to size. No, and let's be clear, responding doesn't mean weakness. It doesn't mean letting people walk all over you. On the contrary, it's a deeper strength. Anyone can lash out, a child can throw a tantrum, but it takes a powerful mind to stay calm under fire, to choose words with precision rather than violence, to stand firm without losing dignity. That is not weakness, it's mastery. History is filled with examples. Leaders who held nations together did not do so by losing control of their tempers at every insult or threat. They responded with strategy, with patience, with vision. Imagine if every great reformer, every wise leader had simply reacted. The world would be chaos. The people we admire most are not those who avoided anger, but those who mastered it, who used it to build rather than destroy. In your personal life, the same principle applies. When you react, anger controls you. When you respond, you control anger. That difference saves marriages, careers, friendships, and futures, because once words are spoken, they cannot be taken back. Once actions are made in rage, they cannot be erased. The damage lingers. But if you pause, if you respond with intention, you can turn a conflict into an opportunity for understanding, or at least avoid turning a spark into an inferno. This is why that tiny space, the pause, is so important. It's easy to underestimate. But inside that space is freedom. Freedom from being a slave to emotion, freedom from regret, freedom from the chaos of reaction. And once you discover that freedom, you begin to see anger not as a curse, but as a tool. Next time you feel that fire rising, remember this: you have a choice. You can let it explode outward blindly, or you can seize that moment of pause, however brief, and decide how to use the energy. Reaction is cheap, response is priceless. Reaction is weakness, response is strength. Reaction destroys, response builds. No, in the end, the ability to respond rather than react is not just about controlling anger. It's about shaping the kind of person you become. Do you want to be ruled by impulses, dragged by every emotion? Or do you want to be someone who commands respect, someone whose words carry weight because they are chosen, not spat out? That decision is made in the heat of the moment every time. And the truth is, no one can make that decision for you, only you can. But if you learn to pause, to reflect, to transform reaction into response, you will find that anger no longer rules your life. If anger is raw energy, instead, then the real question isn't how to get rid of it, but how to use it. Think of electricity. Left uncontrolled, it shocks, burns, and destroys. But when harnessed, it lights entire cities, powers machines, and sustains life as we know it. Anger works the same way. In its raw, unchanneled form, it's dangerous. But when directed with discipline, it becomes one of the most powerful fuels for growth, resilience, and purpose. You see this in athletes. Some of the greatest performances in history weren't achieved in moments of comfort, but in moments of fire. They felt overlooked, underestimated, doubted, and rather than letting that anger eat them alive, they turned it into fuel. They trained harder, pushed longer, and refused to surrender. The anger didn't vanish. It was transformed into discipline. The same is true in social change. Every revolution, every step toward justice began with people who were angry at the way things were. That energy, if left to chaos, could have simply erupted into violence and despair. But when channeled with vision, it became movements that reshaped history. Martin Luther King Jr. wasn't calm because he lacked anger. He was calm because he mastered it and used its energy to build something greater than destruction. In our own lives, this channeling is just as vital. Think about the times you've been most productive. Often, it wasn't when you were perfectly calm and comfortable. It was when you were frustrated with your situation, your habits, your failures. And instead of giving up, you decided enough is enough. That anger became a turning point. It carried you through the resistance that comfort never could. But here lies the critical distinction. When anger is turned against people, it burns relationships, trust, and opportunities. When anger is turned toward purpose, it builds strength, clarity, and progress. It's not about denial. It's about direction. Let's be honest, anger has an addictive quality. There's a thrill in lashing out and unloading all that pent-up energy, but that thrill is short-lived and the damage is long-lasting. The wiser choice is to resist that cheap release and instead invest the energy in something meaningful. If you're angry at being underestimated, channel it into preparation so thorough that no one can ignore you. If you're angry at failure, let it push you into discipline rather than despair. If you're angry at injustice, let it drive you to constructive action rather than destructive vengeance. Channeling anger doesn't mean silencing passion. It means refining it. It's the difference between a flood that destroys everything in its path and a river that sustains life because its energy has been guided. Practically, this requires a shift in perspective. Instead of asking, "Why am I angry?" which we discussed earlier, you now ask, "What can I do with this anger? Where should this energy go?" That question turns a raw emotion into a catalyst for growth. It transforms an obstacle into momentum. Of course, this requires training, just like a muscle. Your ability to channel anger grows with practice. Every time you resist the urge to lash out and instead put that energy into action, you reinforce a new pattern. Over time, you stop being controlled by anger and start being propelled by it, and there's a deeper reward here. When you learn to channel anger, you don't just control an emotion, you transform your identity. You become someone who can take the worst of human feelings and turn it into something that elevates rather than destroys. People trust that kind of strength. They respect it because it's rare. Now, does this mean you'll never slip? No. Everyone reacts at times. Everyone misuses anger at times. But the more you practice channeling it, the quicker you recover and the less damage you leave behind. And eventually, anger becomes less of a curse and more of a compass. It points not just to what's wrong, but to what needs to be made right. So when anger comes, don't fear it. Don't waste it either. See it as a fire placed in your hands. It can burn you or it can warm and guide you. The choice is yours. Direct it at purpose, at growth, at justice, and it will carry you further than calmness ever could. In the end, anger is not a force to be eradicated. It's a force to be mastered. And mastery doesn't mean suppression. It means transformation. The energy is there. You decide whether it destroys or builds.